My name is Michael O'Brien. I'm a partner at the law firm of Winston and Strawn. It's a national, international firm. I'm based in the Chicago office. The question is quite topical. It's a very hot topic these days. Traditionally, the power purchase agreement with a utility off-taker has provided the project developer with a certain revenue stream for the project that's under development, and so that it could demonstrate to investors and to lenders that there's an ability to repay the loans and to provide a return to the investors. The market for traditional power purchase agreements today has been very tight, but there are a number of products that have stepped into the gap to provide or try to address the same types of benefits for the developer. I'll focus on two of the products that are out there today. First is the so-called corporate PPA, and the second is the what I'll call the financial institution hedge. In a lot of ways, both products, the corporate PPA and the financial institution hedge, are very similar. In the typical corporate PPA, you'll have a corporate that is a large consumer of power that has both a need to hedge the risk against fluctuating price of power, but also is relevant here to the wind space. They typically have sustainability goals and to show that they're green and environmentally friendly. So the corporate purchaser will enter into a contract with the developer to basically pay a fixed price per megawatt hour of power on what we refer to as a notional quantity of power. A project seller or the generator of power will agree to pay a floating price, which is typically the market price of power on that same notional. The effect of the cross payment streams is that the project seller locks in the price of power for that notional quantity. Now, the notional quantity can have a number of variants. It could be a pre-agreed scheduled rate, kilowatt hours per megawatt hours, per or it could be based on a proxy generation, what the project should be generating at a certain point in time, or it could be based on actual generation. The financial institution hedge is very similar in that the financial institution which is typically a large bank or investment company or a trading company, is paying a fixed price per megawatt hour of power on a notional amount, and the seller, project seller or generator of the power is paying a fixed price based on market rates. So in that sense, the two products are very similar. Some of the differences come out though in the notional quantities, or in the way in which the agreement is settled. The corporate PPAs are always cash settled, so that there's just a net payment being made. In the financial institution hedges, there can be physical settlement as well as cash settlement. And in fact, in my experience, it's more common that there's physical settlement. What do we mean by physical settlement? It's an obligation on the project seller to put a certain amount of power into the grid, and an obligation on the financial institution buyer to take out a certain amount of power, that same amount of power from the grid. So they're physically settled transactions. Some of the other similarities are the tenor of the terms. Each of the contracts are entered into before or at the same time that construction financing is entered into for the project. So again, the purpose is to demonstrate financial reliability and the ability to repay the debt. But the payments between the parties don't actually start until the project is generating power. So there's a gap period, and we refer to that as a forward starting period. There is credit risk on both sides. The seller is taking credit risk on the buyer, that the buyer is going to be able to pay when it has to. Similarly, the buyer is taking credit risk on the seller. The seller's going to be able to make the payments or to deliver the power when it's supposed to. In the physically settled context, there's a concern on the credit side with early terminations, actually in both senses. If there's an early termination of the agreement for whatever reason, the agreement is so-called mark-to-market, because the market for power has moved since it was initially priced, which results potentially in a very large payment having to be made by one party to the other. So that's where the real credit risk comes out, and it's a much greater risk in a physically settled financial institution hedge than in the corporate PPA. As I was indicating in my first question, there's quite a bit of credit risk in each of the products. Less credit risk in the corporate PPA setting than in the financial institution hedge, principally because of the physical settlement element. Parties address that credit risk usually by various forms of collateral. So it's quite common in the corporate PPA for there to be a letter of credit provided by the seller, which typically is a special purpose project company, has limited assets, so it'll need to go out and obtain a letter of credit to post. The buyer may have to post collateral as well, but many of these buyers are very large corporates, Microsoft, Google, Apple, very, very creditworthy entities. So it's very unusual for those types of entities to actually post collateral, although there may be financial covenants embedded within the PPA itself. In a financial institution hedge, the project seller will typically post a letter of credit, at least during the construction period. And then after the construction period, it's quite common for the financial institution buyer to have a first lien over the assets of the project. It's also sometimes the case that the financial institution has a lien over the assets of the project during construction as well. Maybe a second lien or maybe a shared first lien with the construction lenders. The regulatory status depends on whether the agreement is either physically settled or cash settled. And it's really the same answer for either the corporate PPA or the financial institution hedge. If the agreement is purely cash settled, then you will have a swap agreement for Dodd-Frank purposes. The transaction will then be subject to the Dodd-Frank requirements that are applicable to swap agreements generally. So reporting requirements, record-keeping requirements, etc. If the agreement is physically settled, you do not have a swap agreement for Dodd-Frank purposes. There's an exclusion for physically settled forward contracts from the definition of swap agreement. But depending upon the location of the project, with the physical settlement, you may have FERC regulatory issues to address. Both the project lenders and the equity investors are very concerned with circumstances in which the agreement, again, whether corporate PPA or financial institution hedge, can be early terminated or can be unwound. In that situation, not only do the lenders during construction or the investors after commercial operations lose that predictable revenue flow that they were relying on for the repayment of debt or the repayment of return. But more importantly to the lenders is that you can have a potentially large payment being owed by the project to the counterparty because of the way, if market rates have moved against the project seller. To address these issues, there are a lot of inter-creditor, inter-party agreements that typically are put into these structures that, in essence, will give either the lender or the investors the ability to cure defaults under the underlying agreement, agreements by the corporate or the financial institution to stand still for a certain period of time and not exercise remedies, to allow the lenders or the investors to try to fix the problem.